Thank you, Larry, for inviting me. And time is passing, and I don't want to speak for too long, but it's a huge subject and a hugely important one. And I'm going to hardly scratch the surface, but I'm really interested in the comments that you will make. I come at this with a lot of humility for the subject in defense of social science in times of crisis. The character and status of social and political science in this time of crisis is certainly an important one. It's proper and right that social science should interrogate itself and make its case publicly. Now, my stance on this is, I come at this really as someone who is, I'm really very conventional, I think, in academic terms. I'm professionally and intellectually engaged in research and teaching as a political scientist. I'm not a philosopher of science or social science. I'm a practitioner of the academic discipline of political science in what I hope is a reasonably critical and reflective way. But if I come at this defense of social and political science, I hope I don't come across as too defensive. Right, I feel a little bit defensive about this subject just now. Let me just give you a quick outline of recent work that I've done. This is the kind of thing that I do. I have a paper coming out with Robert Rohrschneider in European Union Politics, which looks at how mainstream versus niche parties represent the public on questions of European integration. We come at this using data that we gathered from expert surveys in 27 European countries that cover every significant party in Europe. And we have an explanation, which is essentially that representation of rising Euroscepticism is left almost exclusively to niche extreme parties, and that mainstream parties are failing in the task of representation. One. I have a paper which is hopefully going to come out soon on the issue of how parties use emotional rhetoric in their appeals to the public, using data from a Harvard social linguistic dictionary. I do that work with a number of other people, and it shows essentially that the use of emotional rhetoric is growing across time, at least in Britain. I have a paper that's come out with Paul Chasty on support for federalism in eastern Ukraine, using data from surveys that we did in late 2014 there. And we published a quick version of this in the Washington Post. And the results essentially show that support for federalism in eastern Ukraine is really low, which horrified both the Putin troll factory, who were all over it, as well as many people in the West who would like to think that if only the Ukrainians would accept federalism, then we could find a solution. And I'm about to do some work in Egypt on surveys in Egypt following the elections with some other colleagues, in which we're trying to actually estimate the real level of support in the population for the Muslim Brotherhood using rather unconventional survey methodology, in particular something called a list experiment. So there we are. The work that I do is highly data-driven. I collect data, and I work in teams, right? And that seems to me to be a characteristic way in which much of the political science that I do works. So I'm wholeheartedly committed to the value of social science against alternative ways we have of trying to speak about the social world. Let me just say baldly, I think this is where I end up. I'm not sure that there is a crisis of social science. I think that we need more social science as social science is done at its best. Moreover, I think that the economic and political crisis that we're facing, however, has largely emboldened anti-scientific thinking that makes and has made the crisis even deeper, more intractable and dangerous, and that social science, as it's practiced at its best, has a really important role to play in attacking anti-scientific thinking. So, as Marx famously observed, the nature of social relationships, perhaps particularly in conditions of modern capitalist societies in crisis, these social relationships are not at all obvious or simple on the surface. common sense observations are constantly overloaded with the moralism of class and other interests and emotions. We can see this perhaps most clearly, and we talked about this quite a bit over the last couple of days, in the moralism of austerity, in which the simple assumptions of the household economy are applied to whole economies to our detriment, and where some aspects of reality, government debt and spending, are often successfully made most salient to a common sense understanding by those who would benefit most by cutting, while ignoring larger features of the economy as a whole. Consider the utter disaster that followed the common sense of the creditors and their believers in the 1920s and 30s, summed up most famously by Andrew Mellon's suggestions to Herbert Hoover, his injunction, and I quote, to liquidate labor, liquidate stocks, liquidate farmers, liquidate real estate. It will, and it gets worse, right? It will purge the rottenness out of the system. High costs of living and high living will come down. People will work harder, live a more moral life. Values will be adjusted, and enterprising people will pick up from less competent people. Now, this was advice that was largely taken in hand in the late 20s and early 30s. And thankfully, we had Roosevelt to come along to say that this was absurd. Thank goodness, therefore, in response to the most recent crisis, that Keynes and his contemporary fellows have been able to demonstrate the economic futility of the paradox of thrift, to insist with greater or lesser degrees of success, worse in Europe, I think, but inadequate everywhere, on states, including banks, state banks, taking counter-cyclical measures to avoid even worse outcomes. Now, as bad as things are, I think my point is, thank goodness that we learn something, or that social scientists and some economists anyways learn something and were able to influence events such that we did not end up in the catastrophe that we found ourselves in the 1930s, or at least we haven't yet. Right? There's little in my view that can speak more highly to the value of social science in this crisis and against common sense, Philistine moralism and emotions and the powers that be, which has helped save us from even greater disaster. I think we should thank the macroeconomists like Krugman, Stiglitz, and others enormously, and we need to listen to them more. More social science is what we need. Now, tell me how much time I've got, because I've got
another 10 minutes easily.
Right. I mean, I could tell you about a little bit about some bits of social science that I think are utterly brilliant and which, provide an example of what social science can do and its limits. We care, and we've talked about this a little bit, we care about someone's origins, whether it's wrong or right. We think it's wrong that someone's origins should define his or her destinations in life. Now, of course, I think that the only truly appropriate response is to ensure that everyone has a decent destination, but that doesn't make me indifferent to the unfairness and wastefulness of allowing inherited privilege to dominate life chances. But there's a great and brilliant book, in my view, written by John Goldthorpe and Robert Erickson called The Constant Flux, which utilizes empirical data across many developed economies, including Hungary's, going back to 1945 and up until, I believe, 1995. It gets this data from ISCO data, which codes individuals' occupation, and on the basis of this data, it creates a class schema called the Erickson-Goldthorpe class schema, and then looks to see whether using that class scheme, Class of origin defines class of destination. Broadly speaking, what they show from 1945 to the end of the data time point that they were able to use is that, and here's what I think is fascinating, is that relative class chances, right, that is to say, the chance of you being from class A moving to class B over the chances of someone already in class B moving or staying in class B, right, the relative class life chances are more or less constant across all of the countries that they observe. Constant across countries and more or less constant over time. They fluctuate, but they don't change very much. Now, this is extremely interesting, isn't it? Right? It suggests that there are mechanisms at work in the social sphere and in class relations, which tend heavily to reproduce themselves over time, despite very different circumstances. There was a work by, I believe, a sociologist, Andorka, a Hungarian sociologist, who then studies this in the communist period, and you would think communism must transform social mobility prospects. And he looks at the period between 48 and I believe 1960 or 62, and discovers that there is a short-term rupture in class mobility relations, which then reasserts itself, the social world reasserts itself. And why? Well, because those who were disrupted early on, the previously privileged, find ways of adapting to the new order and reestablish their relative life chances. They join the Communist Party, for example. They get to manipulate bureaucratic systems. And we know Ivan Zeleny is not here today, but such that Zeleny, towards the end of the communist period, says that the only way, the best way to start to disrupt standard patterns in which classes reproduce themselves is by the introduction of market mechanisms. Radical, and probably only worked, if it worked at all, for relatively short periods of time. Now, those are interesting, they're challengeable. I think it's an example of social science at its best. But what is it about it that I really like? What is it about it? It's not that I think it's necessarily true, right? It's that it operates and engages with the world in the most rigorous way that we can imagine. It's about doing social science. What is it? What are the things that are going on when they're doing social science well, in this case? First, they're moving from concepts and trying to define concepts. In this case, the concept is class. We find, by the way, the brilliant studies by Marmot and Wilkinson about health inequalities show more or less the same thing, right? That across countries and across types of health systems, relative health outcomes remain more or less constant. The relative health advantages of some groups of people are sustained despite significant changes in the way in which health is delivered. So you move from concept to measurement, right? So every concept that we operate with is rightly subject, must be subject to critical appraisal and skepticism. And here's another thing that I think social science has to take on board if it's to do its work well. It is likely that concepts will inadequately represent the world. They're most likely going to be inadequate. Social scientists are fond of saying that we look at the world through a glass darkly. Because even if we're able to have clear concepts in mind, we only have limited capacities to generate observational data. But at least social science as a method demands that concepts define the terms for their own validation. Let me just go through some of the other things that I think are extremely good about science, social science at its best. It's falsifiable. Not only should concepts and measures be valid, but propositions should be presented in ways that have the potential to be shown to be wrong. They probably will be wrong, but they have to be presented in such a way that they can be shown to be wrong. Replicability. This refers, I think, not only to the need for data being made available or being possible to recreate, but also that social science per se isn't really concerned with one-off events, but with categories of events that may be studied in multiple contexts. If all events are unique, then there's really no need and possibility of social science. This doesn't mean, however, that social science are indifferent to the elements of the unique in their own observations and in their studies, but that they will operate in the belief that they can and must construct their research to give sufficient leverage to see how common factors operate across contexts, either directly or in interaction with specific conditions. Fourth, scope. Social science, it doesn't matter whether I don't care about qualitative or quantitative divide. I don't think it's an important distinction. I think qualitative, quantitative social sciences all can work in the same way. But social science makes use of the comparative method to draw inferences about the strength of relationships. I think it has to be quite modest about that. I think we could only, in a very hesitant way, make causal claims, because causality is just very hard to observe directly, because many relations are endogenous, temporality is extremely difficult to estimate, and in general there are, in any case, too many variables and too few cases. There's a lot of attention being paid these days to laboratory experiments in social science to try and estimate causal relations, but at least I remain quite skeptical about them, particularly with regard to their scope outside laboratory conditions, right? But social scientists take the question of drawing inferences very seriously indeed when they're working at their best, and they will explain the scope of any of their claims by saying that we only think that these relationships work under these sorts of circumstances. So, that's what I think social science does at its best. It manages to put propositions about relationships that we think we observe among phenomena and to which we ascribe regularity to a rigorous test to see if what we believe about the world is plausibly justifiable and whether we can observe such relations to obtain in the context in which we expect it. Yes. Now, there's lots of ways in which social science does things badly, and we should just recognize them. I think it has a limited capacity really to define what counts as an important thing to investigate. So a common justification in the scholarly literature is that we study something because no one has studied it yet, or at least they haven't really studied it out in Mongolia. And I think the result is that social science is frequently narrow and trivial. Many non-social scientists ask big questions about the world and look to social science to address them, but they find that social science frequently fails. And I think that's part of the reasons that social scientists are marginalized as compared to historians these days in public debate. Second, social scientists are often just data and technique driven, rather than driven by substantive questions. Now, I don't think there's any social science without the most rigorous methods, since the ability to demonstrate, or at least to indicate, defend the proposition that relationships that we observe are genuine, will only be possible if you have the most careful and sophisticated ways of approaching it. But frequently, technicality merely adds to the narrowness of social science. Third, I think social science are really bad at theorizing. And for a long time, we've been driven, particularly by economists and first by neoclassical, neoliberal economists, then by behavioral economics, which is yet another complete blind alley in my view, to try and say, what is the underlying theory of human motivations? I think it's gone nowhere, and I think we should try and get back to just finding the best possible regularities that we can find and leave the theorizing about individual things to later. Fourth, social science is not exempt from all the pressures of the modern university as part of the knowledge economy of modern capitalism and its state. Now, I think this has been negative side of modern social science has been brilliantly set out by Terry Eagleton in a recent article in the Chronicle of Higher Education called The Slow Death of the University. The UK, United Kingdom, is certainly to the fore in this transformation. Social science is not only yoked to a set of tractable questions to be of direct assistance to the corporate world, but increasingly social scientists see themselves less as academics and intellectuals than as entrepreneurs and technicians. So for those who see social science to have a higher purpose, devoted to large questions and broader moral values, this development is of great regret. Fifth, bad social science or social science is lost trust and public understanding along with many, many other parts of our elite society. The questioning of social society, of social science, of course, has been ever since Mill took the subject on in Spirit of the Age and his other work when he railed against the intrusions of mass democratic society, spurred on by the yellow press, giving credence to the view that all opinion about society is equally valid, which meant for Mill that the voice of expert reason is just lost in the welter of noisy opinion. And I think that this kind of affront to social science is evident today in a broader way, with trust in science in general hugely challenged, and often for good reason. I mean, think about the recent study in California, I think it was in California, involving the kind of fraudulent basis of a claim for gay marriage persuasion study, which turned out to be made-up data, not well supervised, and so on. And there we are. So where does that leave us? I want to come to a conclusion, as you'll be delighted to hear. So I started this with a statement about humility that I feel as a practicing social science. I think that it's actually the case that social scientists at their best are pretty humble sort of people. They're humble in the face of the huge difficulty that there is in saying anything that's defensible. I think at its best we're cautious in our beliefs, even if it's also true that the strictures of personality or promotion criteria require us to overclaim. So I think that this kind of cautiousness about what we do as social scientists is also a problem for many intellectuals who think that science or social science should have a really high kind of character and status. So, as I say, from Saint-Simon to Mill, social scientists were thought to constitute a kind of elite, sometimes in conjunction with the industrialists, sometimes on their own. For much of the last century, I think the academic, intellectual scholar held both social sway and status, and self-invested in their own sense of moral high ground. Social science, being an intellectual, was a kind of a calling, an obligation, a vocation. It wasn't just a bloody, grubby job or career. And I think that part of the problem with social science and its sense of decline is that it's perceived by intellectuals now to be a kind of career, with very, very narrow ways of working, not something that's highly moral in its regard or takes the view that it can be highly instructive. So finally, back to the crisis. I indicated earlier that social science has played a huge role in stopping the crisis from being even worse. I think it has an ability to play a major role in further extracting us from it. But there's absolutely no doubt, I think, that the crisis has been a breeding ground for the revival of know-nothing, anti-scientific, moralizing ideologues whose unencumbered views have the potential to bring on the most awful policies and conflicts. Left to their own devices, I think that there's every possibility things will be significantly worse. So how is my view of a kind of social science at its best to respond to this kind of irrationalist, emotional, nasty term? So I think that in the face of the crisis, social science has a role to play. I don't think it's going to be a return of the social status of social scientists as an intellectual elite. Fortunately, the social scientist is working assiduously with her data and measures. I think that model is here to stay, means that it's not possible any longer to defensively make an argument about the world and its trajectory that is not subject to the most rigorous conceptual and empirical scrutiny, at least within the Social Science Academy. The training of the next generation of academics in these methods, and you can see it happening within the universities, will intensify the hold of this view of social science on academic thinking. It's going to get more powerful, in my view, this conception of social science. Which means that social scientists have to take on the responsibility of demanding of other elites and demagogues who wish to stamp their moral vision on the world to defend themselves in the light of the best scrutiny that we can put on the evidence. So our elites should perhaps be more like us, modest, less arrogant, more humble in the face of the difficulties of establishing truths about the world. Social scientists should hold their nerve and continue to organize to defend social science at its best. Now, would this be a new paradigm for social science? I don't think it's a new paradigm for social science, but I think it has the capacity to contribute to a new paradigm of doing politics and economics in the world. Thank you.